Do scientists actually make things up? A comment on one of my videos was that scientists are basically lying and researchers are lying about, various different things. And it turns out it's actually a really difficult question. And that person I know that they were being a little bit over the top and sort of not understanding the context that much. But it actually turns out to be a lot more difficult question to answer than I can possibly say. So on one side, I want to sort of point out that science evolved basically from religious efforts, right? So if you look at all of the scientists from long time ago, almost all of them were somehow related to religion. That was the key thing. If you look at most of the mathematicians, they were all somehow related in the religious efforts. If you look at most of the philosophers, they're related, not the Greek philosophers, but the philosophers from the 1500s and all that kind of stuff. They were doing it out of some sort of religious joy of exploration, and that's the thing that's kind of interesting, right? And so how this sort of evolved is that as people sort of studying things and sort of looking at the world, and they discovered how things work. Now this is it's sort of a quick synopsis of how this actually works. I'm not a historian in any sort of way, but that's the basic story. If you look at almost all of the philosophers from 400 or 500 years ago in mathematics, in any of the scientists, they're going to be related to religious efforts. It's just the way that the whole world worked. And a big part of this was a push, and sort of the underlying story was a push towards sort of practicalism, or practice, where you were looking at practicalism. I'm not sure it's a word, but basically pragmatism. So looking at the world and sort of looking at the empirical world around us and saying, hey, you know what, this is kind of an unusual thing that this happens. We believe that this particular thing happens. Why is that actually happening like that? And then when they have that sort of weird anomaly, right? So that's where they're not necessarily making things up. They're looking at real world stuff, and they're gathering real world stuff, and they're looking at these kind of weird anomalies that happen. And they're like, oh, this is weird, right? Like Copernicus and Galileo, they looked at the sky and they're like, things are wiggling up there. These planets should not be, celestial bodies should not be wiggling the way that they are. And the explanation that they came up with was that the sun, the planets revolve around the sun, not the planets revolve around the earth, and the sun revolves around the earth. So it's kind of an interesting thing, right? And it was just almost like a matter of convenience where they came up with this idea. Because it sort of just made a little bit more sense in terms of explaining the real world. And that's where we do make things up, right? Like, we just have the sort of presumption that the world is not the way that we think about it. And it's sort of an artifact of how to understand the world. It's really hard to understand how the world actually works. And not a single person in this world will tell you how the world actually works and be right. We just don't know, right? And that's the presumption that we all go with as scientists and researchers. We just don't really know if we're doing the right thing, but we think we can explain things a little better. And if somebody came up with something, a better solution, a better idea that explained a whole bunch of different things, we would use that, right? Like, as far as I understand, gravity, how gravity actually works, we know it exists, but from what I understand, I'm not a theoretical physicist in any sort of way, but we still really don't have a good understanding of why it actually happens. And that's where we're sort of pondering things and thinking about things. It's like, why does that happen? What's going on there? What is really truly going on? We can't explain those things, and that's where we come up with this sort of high-fluting idea where we're like, wait a minute, where does this come from? What is that? And so that eureka moment, right? You've all heard of that story where was a Newton that was sitting there and an apple fell on his head and it was like, eureka. That eureka moment, we can't explain. We don't know how it goes. There's not good research on that. I've reviewed a few papers on this. As an innovation scholar, we look at that kind of stuff. And we don't have a good sense and why that happens. What's going on there? We can say that knowledge that we have is based on prior knowledge and based on sort of refinements to prior knowledge and combining prior knowledge. This sort of recombination is called. But we don't really understand why do we have these sort of massive breakthrough things? And that's where the moment where the making crap up is kind of partly true. As we go about and do these things, I wish we can have this like hard understanding where we can say this is the way that the world actually works, but it's never going to work that way, unfortunately. But we can have better explanations that explain the physical world. And that's where scientists sometimes depart from, there's sort of two moments, right? So that's where it departs from culture, is that they see weird things, right? They pick up on insights that are like, wait a minute, this empirical phenomenon's going on. We know about it and we can't explain it. So we're going to come up with some sort of solution to explain this particular thing. And so they come up with that, right? And then the other thing is, in terms of understanding the world, they might not necessarily agree on things. Every once in a while, it's kind of normal where scientists and researchers come up with competing ideas, and then they sort of battle it out. So here's where we know that it's kind of a big leap just to say everything is made up, is that the whole profession is a bunch of jerks. And that this is true, right? Like this is what science is about, is really a bunch of jerky people that are tearing apart other people's ideas. So to the best of their ability, it's a battle, right? You imagine like a gladiator battle where people are sort of battling over ideas and we don't necessarily know what are the right ideas. And if there's competing theories, often, we'll come up with different solutions to resolve those competing theories, or eventually one of them doesn't necessarily win, but it just becomes just more popular, I guess. The other one just kind of fades away as like, oh, that's just old stuff. But it doesn't mean it's not, it doesn't mean that it's like irrelevant. It just means that it just kind of faded away in existence. So I just want to point out, like, that problem, that question, do we just make things up? It's a really hard thing to answer, and a good question. Good on you for thinking about that, because it's partly right, but also partly not right. I don't want to give you an impression. So here's how I know that that the world, that we know more about the world than what most people sort of assume. I want you to look around and name something that is not part of modern culture around you right now. Just look around, right? Look at something that's not part of modern culture, that has not benefited or not been a central reason because of the scientific effort. And that's it. I want you to look at that and you realize everything that we have in existence is because of science. All right, take care and have a wonderful day.